Hey, today I want to talk about a very important issue that is both important to the employer and the employee alike. So every day there are employees that put in a lot of work and put in a lot of sweat and pour their very souls to the service of their employers. They work tirelessly in the hope that they'll provide for their families and in the promise of a better and secure future. But what happens when tragedy strikes? Most employers turn a blind eye to these employees when they're faced with work injuries or when they contract occupational diseases, leaving the employees to face the daunting reality of piling medical bills, lost wages, and an uncertain future. In realizing the injustice, the deep injustice that this is, the law came up with what we call the Work Injuries and Benefits Act, which is to ensure that whenever an employee gets injured at the workplace or following a work-related activity, or whenever an employee contracts what we call an occupational disease, then they get compensated by their employer. All right? So today we want to talk about WIBA. WIBA is the Work Injuries and Benefits Act, and we also want to talk about DOSHI, which is the Directorate of Occupational and Health Safety. All right? So whenever an employee gets hurt at the workplace, there are industries that are especially notorious for having employees getting injured at the workplace. Notably construction industries, manufacturing industries, hospitality industries, name them. Okay? So some of these accidents involve people slipping and falling, because the floors are slippery or because the floors are not leveled, or straining and spraining because of lifting heavy items or not deploying proper ways of lifting heavy items. Or accidents. There are people who just get road accidents, but their job is to drive goods from one place to the other, and as a result of which the accident has occurred out of or in connection with their employment. Or they can get burns, people maybe who cook, or people who are in the manufacturing space and they are exposed to flames or to acids. Or they can have what we call machinery injuries. You get caught up in between machineries, you lose your arm, or it gets crushed, or it gets amputated, or it gets lacerations. Or you can just have violence, work-related violence, where maybe you are a medical practitioner and you get a patient who's mentally disturbed and they beat you up. So whenever you get a work injury that is related to your employment, or is or occurred out of or in connection with the employment, then the employer is supposed to pay you compensation for the medical bills, for lost wages if you are disabled, and for the disability situation. All right? So, according to the Work Injuries and Benefits Act, the employer has certain obligations. One of the obligations is to ensure that they take an insurance cover to ensure that when an employee gets a work injury, then the insurance cover compensates. The employer also is supposed to put in the records of all their employees and what they earn, so that their earnings can be used in the calculation of how much compensation they ought to get. And the employee also ought to report whenever there's an accident at the workplace to the Directorate of Occupational and Safety. And lastly, the employer ought to put a record or document whatever happens in the event there's an accident that happens at the workplace. So I talked about the work injuries. I want to talk also about the occupational diseases. So there are diseases that employees also contract as a result of just working for their employers. Namely, you can contract skin diseases if you have exposure to metallic, corrosive metallic or irritants. You can contract what we call, which is a notorious disease called asbestosis, which is basically inhaling of asbestos and causing you to have lung problems and breathing problems, you can contract what we call occupational lung cancer. If you're exposed to asbestos or you're exposed to silica dust, you can contract some of these conditions. You can contract musculoskeletal disorders if you strain and sprain your muscles. You can contract hearing-induced problems. So if you work at very noisy places, say the airport, or you work for telecommunication companies, or you work as a call center, etc. You can contract what we call occupational dermatitis, which is basically a skin condition that has been brought about by exposure to certain chemicals. You can contract what we call silicosis, which is again exposure to silica dust if you work in the mining industry. So I've taken time to actually explain these diseases so that you can know if your family or your friends work in certain industries, and those industries are more prone to contracting such diseases. So if you have contracted a disease, or if you have been injured at the workplace, what should you do and what is the procedure? Okay, so the first thing that you need to do is, if you've been injured at the workplace, you ensure that you report to 2 places, actually 3 places. The first place is you report to your employer, and if it involves a fatality, you must report to your employer within 24 hours. But you report to your employer immediately that you get this accident. You also, by the same breath, issue a report to the DOSHI, which is the Directorate of Occupational Safety. And then you can also issue a report to your advocate. And I'll explain why this is important. When you issue to your employer, he's under the responsibility to also report to the Directorate of Occupational Safety. So it's a formal way. If you do not issue the notice to your employer, then the employer would say that he did not know that you had an accident, or you are diagnosed with an occupational disease. So it's important to first issue that notice to your employer. It's important to issue the notice to the DOSHI, because the DOSHI is, under the law, the people who are mandated to investigate the accident, to subject you to medical examination, and ultimately to ensure that you get just compensation. Okay? That responsibility is no longer vested with court as a first instance. So ukipata accident alafu ukimbie kotini kusue your employer, you probably not get compensated. Itaambiwa kwamba court haina jurisdiction, utarudishwa back to the Directorate of Occupational Safety. So the Directorate of Occupational Safety is the right place where you need to go and report. So una report kwa employer wako, una report kwa Directorate of Occupational Safety, alafu unamwarifu pia wakili wako kwamba nimepata either an accident at the workplace, ama I have been just diagnosed with a work related disease. Okay? Now once you do that, the employer, again, as I said, is under the responsibility to report to the Directorate of Occupational Safety again before 7 days lapse. So wewe umemwambia nilipata accident, alafu yeye sasa formally atamwambia the Directorate of Occupational Safety that niko na employee wangu mmoja hapa alipata ajali. So Directorate of Occupational Safety sasa yeye atafanya uchunguzi, he'll do inquiries, he will conduct investigations into how that accident occurred. He'll prepare, he'll have a report. If need be, he will subject the employee to medical testing to ascertain the extent of the injuries, and also just to understand how those injuries or how that occupational disease was contracted. So it's important. Then after that, there is a particular schedule that governs the Directorate of Occupational Safety to grant you compensation for your injuries. So kama maybe umevunjika mguu, ama umekatika kidole, ama umevunjika mgongo, ama uko na jeraha, kidonda kikubwa ambacho kinakufanya usiweze kufanya kazi, then the Directorate of Occupational Safety atajua ni kwa kiwango gani ama ni asilimia gani ya disablement yenye imekupata, and they'll compensate you. So under the law, how this is calculated, you would be paid for your salary for 96 months. So watachukua your salary, wachukue marupurupu yote ambayo umekuwa uki earn, including overtime and other allowances, and then they get the total salary, and then they calculate that salary times 96 months. That becomes your compensation. But then again, so that's the total compensation. But then again, kuna the levels of disablement. So Directorate of Occupational Safety atasema kwamba wewe asilimia yako ya ulemavu ni maybe 30% kama umevunjika tu kidole ama mkono. Kuna wale ambao asilimia yao ya ulemavu ni 100%. Hao ndio watalipwa 96 months. Lakini kama yako ni 10% ama yako ni 30% ama 40%, utalipwa kulingana na ile asilimia ya ulemavu ambayo hii accident ama hii occupational disease imekusababishia. Okay? So the last person that I said you need to report to ni wakili. Why is it important for you ku report hii issue kwa wakili? Sababu from the very first step when you get the injuries or when you contract the occupational disease, wakili wako anaweza kukuguide. He'll probably tell you this is the kind of evidence that we need. Tunahitaji maybe medical report, the initial assessment, tunahitaji treatment plan, tunahitaji the progress report, ili ajue wewe uliumia kinamna gani, na ili aweze kusema kwamba haya majeraha yalihusiana na kazi yako. So wakili atakusaidia kwa hilo. Wakili pia atakusaidia in case doshi, because zingine doshi they end up giving a decision that is not fair. Wewe umeumia, umevunjika miguu yote miwili, lakini unawadiwa 100,000. Unaona, that is not fair. Hapa ndo wakili wako atakuja aseme, bwana, client wangu amevunjika miguu yote miwili na kulingana na sheria na the extent of ulemavu wanapaswa alipwe kiwango fulani cha pesa. Okay, so wakili atakusaidia katika ku enforce katika ku ensure that there's compliance. Either employer amekulipa ama insurance imekulipa. Na wakili pia atakusaidia kukata rufaa or put in an appeal. So in the event that doshi imepatiana uamuzi wake, then within 60 days unapaswa umekata rufaa kama haujafurahia ule uamuzi ambao doshi umefanya. Hapa ndio wakili anaweza kukusaidia. Wakili will also help you negotiate a settlement with your employer. Kumbuka, you are entitled not only to your compensation ya kisheria, you are also entitled to being paid for the medical expenses zenye hii majeraha inasababisha imetukia. You also entitled to be paid lost wages, and you are entitled to be paid rehabilitation expenses, na pia you are entitled to be paid for any disability yenye itakuwa imetukia hapo. Kwa hiyo this Work Injuries and Benefits Act is extremely important kuhakikisha kwamba wewe kama ni mwajiriwa na unafanyia mwajiri wako kazi, na kwa bahati mbaya umeanguka ama kwa bahati mbaya umepata magonjwa ambayo yanahusiana na kazi ambayo unaifanya, kwamba mwajiri wako anakulipa. And I've tried to speak a bit in Kiswahili because I understand a bulk of the people who get affected by these work injuries ni watu ambao maybe kipato chao si cha juu sana. Hivyo si kusema kwamba mtu ambaye ako na kipato cha juu hawezi patikana na janga kama hili. Unaweza kuwa uko manager kwa kampuni fulani lakini ukaanguka, ukavunjika mguu. It is the responsibility of your employer kuhakikisha kwamba umepata compensation. So as always, this is Law 254. Mimi ni wakili Kiti. Ningetaka kusikia story yako. Ningetaka kusikia kama wewe umepata jeraha ama umepata ugonjwa unaohusiana na mwajiri wako. Ikiwa umepata hilo janga, tafadhali usikimbilie kotini. Kama nilivyokuambia, muarifu wakili wako, muarifu doshi na muarifu mwajiri wako. Na kutokea hapo wakili wako atakusaidia every step of the way mpaka uhakikishe kwamba umefidiwa ama umepata fidia ya haki. Hayo kwa sasa. Mwenyezi Mungu awabariki. Cheers.